Poor boy speaks to millionaire. Don't get on this plane, it's going to crash. What happened next left everyone in shock. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video, give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The bustling corridors of O'Hare International Airport echoed with the usual cacophony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps. Among the sea of travelers, 11-year-old Jake Thompson stood out, his small frame weaving through the crowd with determined urgency. His bright blue eyes scanned the terminal, searching for a face he'd only seen in newspapers and on TV. Jake's heart raced as he clutched a brown paper bag in his sweaty hands. Inside was a special order from his grandmother's convenience store, a pack of imported cigars and a vintage lighter. But Jake wasn't thinking about the delivery anymore. His mind was consumed by the conversation he'd overheard just minutes ago, a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Flight 2487 to New York, it's perfect. The old man won't know what hit him, a gruff voice had said, followed by a sinister chuckle. Jake had been waiting in line at a coffee shop when the words reached his ears, spoken by a man in a dark suit who quickly disappeared into the crowd. Now Jake was on a mission. He knew that William Hartley, the famous Chicago real estate tycoon, was scheduled to be on that very flight. Jake had recognized the man's name from countless news reports about his latest skyscraper project downtown. He had to warn him, but how? As Jake rounded a corner, he collided with a tall, imposing figure. Looking up, he found himself face to face with Michael Carter, William Hartley's head of security. Jake had seen him in photos accompanying articles about the millionaire. "Whoa there, kid," Michael said, steadying Jake with a firm hand on his shoulder. "What's the rush?" Jake's words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. "Please, sir, I need to speak to Mr. Hartley. It's urgent." Michael's expression hardened. "Mr. Hartley is a very busy man. He doesn't have time for—" "It's about his flight," Jake interrupted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I overheard something. He can't get on that plane." Something in Jake's earnest plea must have struck a chord with Michael. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded curtly and led Jake through a set of glass doors into a private lounge. There, surrounded by leather chairs and mahogany tables, stood William Hartley. The millionaire cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. He was in the middle of a heated phone conversation but paused when he saw Michael approach with Jake in tow. "What's this about, Carter?" William asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Before Michael could answer, Jake blurted out, "Mr. Hartley, please don't get on your flight. I think someone's planning to hurt you." The lounge fell silent. William's eyes narrowed as he studied the young boy before him. "That's quite an accusation, young man. What's your name?" "Jake, sir, Jake Thompson." William exchanged a glance with Michael, then turned back to Jake. "All right, Jake. Tell me exactly what you heard." As Jake recounted the overheard conversation, he could see the wheels turning in William's mind. The millionaire's expression grew grave, and he motioned for Michael to come closer. "Carter, get on the phone with airport security immediately. I want a full sweep of that plane before it leaves the ground." While Michael made the call, William turned his attention back to Jake. "That was very brave of you to come forward, son. But tell me, what brings you to the airport today? Surely not to play detective." Jake held up the brown paper bag. "I'm making a delivery for my grandma's store. She owns Thompson's corner store on Wabash Avenue." A flicker of recognition passed over William's face. "Thompson's? I know that place. Best cup of coffee in the Loop." He paused, studying Jake more closely. "You said your name is Thompson. Any relation to Sophia Thompson?" Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "That's my mom. How do you know her?" Before William could respond, Michael returned, his face grim. "Sir, airport security found a suspicious device on board. They're evacuating the plane now and calling in the bomb squad." The color drained from William's face. He looked at Jake with newfound appreciation. "It seems I owe you my life, young man." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Jake felt a mix of relief and disbelief. He had actually saved someone's life. But amidst the commotion, he couldn't shake the nagging question. How did Mr. Hartley know his mother? In the hours that followed, the airport became a whirlwind of activity. Police swarmed the terminal, questioning passengers and staff. Jake found himself recounting his story multiple times to stern-faced detectives. Through it all, William Hartley remained by his side, his presence both reassuring and puzzling. As the day wore on, Jake's grandmother, Margaret, arrived at the airport frantic with worry. Her weathered face, usually set in a stern expression, crumpled with relief when she saw Jake safe and sound. "Oh, Jake," she cried, pulling him into a tight embrace. "When you didn't come back, I feared the worst." William stepped forward, introducing himself to Margaret. "Your grandson is a hero, Mrs. Thompson. He may have saved my life today." Margaret's eyes widened as she took in the well-dressed man before her. "Mr. Hartley? The Mr. Hartley?" As William explained the situation, Jake noticed his grandmother's expression shift from shock to something more complex, a mix of gratitude and, was that unease? "We owe you a debt of gratitude," William said, his voice warm. "I'd like to invite you both to dinner tonight. My treat, of course." Margaret hesitated, her hand tightening on Jake's shoulder. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hartley, but we couldn't possibly—" "I insist," William interjected gently. "It's the least I can do. Besides," he added, his eyes twinkling, "I'd love to catch up with an old friend. How is Sophia these days?" Jake felt his grandmother stiffen beside him. There it was again, that strange connection between Mr. Hartley and his mother. What was going on? Before Jake could ponder further, William's phone rang. He excused himself to take the call, leaving Jake and Margaret alone for a moment. "Grandma," Jake whispered urgently, "how does Mr. Hartley know Mom?" Margaret's face was a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "It's complicated, Jake. Your mother and Mr. Hartley have a history, one that's best left in the past." Jake's mind raced with questions, but before he could voice them, William returned, his face grave. "I'm afraid I have some unsettling news," he said, his voice low. "The police have reason to believe that the attempt on my life wasn't random. They think it might be connected to, well, to events from my past." Margaret's sharp intake of breath didn't escape Jake's notice. What was going on? What secrets were the adults hiding? As they left the airport, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his simple errand had set in motion something far bigger than he could have imagined. The weight of unspoken truths hung in the air, as tangible as the evening. Mist settling over Chicago. Little did Jake know that this day marked the beginning of a journey that would unravel long-buried secrets, test the bonds of family, and force them all to confront the shadows of the past. As they drove through the city streets, the skyscrapers looming overhead seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the story to unfold. The Thompsons' modest sedan followed William's sleek black car through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. Jake's mind whirled with questions, each turn bringing them closer to answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. As they pulled up to an upscale restaurant, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the car window. In just one day, he felt like he had aged years. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on his young shoulders, and he knew that whatever came next would change his life forever. Little did he know the true revelations were yet to come, waiting to emerge from the shadows of the past and reshape the future for everyone involved. The aroma of fine cuisine wafted through the air as Jake, Margaret, William, and Michael were seated at a secluded table in the upscale restaurant. Jake's eyes widened at the crystal chandeliers and plush velvet chairs, a far cry from the vinyl booths at his mother's diner. William leaned in, his voice low. "I've taken the liberty of ordering some appetizers. I hope you don't mind." Margaret nodded stiffly, her hands fidgeting with the napkin in her lap. The tension at the table was palpable, and Jake couldn't help but feel like he was sitting on a powder keg, waiting for it to explode. As they waited for their food, William turned his attention to Jake. "So, young man, tell me more about yourself. What grade are you in?" Jake swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small under the millionaire's gaze. "I'm in 6th grade, sir. I go to Lincoln Elementary." William's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Lincoln Elementary? That's where—" He trailed off, exchanging a meaningful glance with Margaret. Jake's curiosity got the better of him. "That's where what, Mr. Hartley?" Before William could respond, Margaret cut in sharply. "It's not important, Jake. Why don't you tell Mr. Hartley about your science project? As Jake launched into a description of his volcano experiment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the adults were having a silent conversation over his head. Michael, who had been quiet until now, watched the exchange with keen interest, his eyes darting between William and Margaret. The appetizers arrived, momentarily breaking the tension. As they ate, William steered the conversation to safer topics: Jake's hobbies, his favorite subjects in school, his friends. But beneath the pleasant small talk, Jake could sense an undercurrent of unease. Finally, as the main course was served, William set down his fork and fixed Margaret with a serious look. "Margaret, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Jake deserves to know the truth." Margaret's face paled. "William, please. Not here. Not now." But William pressed on. "It's been 20 years, Margaret. Don't you think it's time?" Jake looked between them, his heart racing. "Time for what? What's going on?" William took a deep breath. "Jake, the reason I know your mother, it's because we used to be very close. In fact, Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the front of the restaurant. A woman's voice, shrill and angry, cut through the murmur of diners. "Where is he? Where's William Hartley?" Jake turned to see a striking woman in her 40s, her dark hair disheveled, and her eyes wild with fury. She stormed towards their table, pointing an accusing finger at William. "You bastard!" she spat. "Did you think you could hide from me forever?" William stood, his face a mask of shock, and was that guilt? "Rebecca, please, this isn't the place." "Oh, isn't it?" Rebecca sneered. "Where is the place, William? Where's the place to confront the man who destroyed my family?" Jake watched, in stunned silence, as the scene unfolded. Michael had moved to stand protectively near William, while Margaret looked like she wanted to sink into her chair and disappear. Rebecca's gaze swept over the table, landing on Jake. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's true. He looks just like you." Jake's head was spinning. What did she mean? Why did this strange woman think he looked like Mr. Hartley? William's voice was strained as he addressed Rebecca. "We should take this somewhere private. Please, let's not make a scene." But Rebecca was beyond reason. "A scene? You want to talk about scenes? How about the scene you made when you walked out on us, on your own flesh and blood?" The pieces started to fall into place in Jake's mind, each revelation hitting him like a physical blow. He turned to William, his voice small and trembling. Are you my father?" The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on their table. William's face crumpled, the carefully constructed facade of the powerful businessman giving way to raw, naked emotion. "Yes, Jake," he said softly. "I am your father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jake felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the enormity of this revelation. He looked to his grandmother for confirmation, but Margaret's eyes were fixed on the table, unable to meet his gaze. Rebecca let out a bitter laugh. "Well, isn't this a touching family reunion? Tell me, William, does your son know about his half-sister, about the family you abandoned to play house with his mother?" Jake's head snapped. "Up, half-sister?" William's voice was pleading now. "Rebecca, please, this isn't how I wanted this to happen. Let me explain." But Rebecca was already turning away, her parting shot laced with venom. "Explain all you want, William. Just know that your lies have finally caught up with you." As she stormed out of the restaurant, an uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Jake felt like he was drowning, struggling to process the torrent of information that had just been dumped on him. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Jake, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. We never meant for you to find out like this." Jake looked at her, tears welling in his eyes. "You knew. All this time you knew who my father was?" Margaret nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Your mother made me promise not to tell you. She wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "From knowing the truth, from knowing my own father?" William reached out, trying to place a comforting hand on Jake's shoulder, but the boy flinched away. "Jake, please. I know this is a lot to take in, but if you'll let me explain." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear any more lies." With that, he bolted from the table, ignoring the calls of his name behind him. He ran through the restaurant, past the startled waiters and curious diners, out into the cool Chicago night. The city lights blurred through his tears as Jake ran, not knowing where he was going, only knowing he had to get away. His mind was a chaotic whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, hurt, betrayal. He found himself in a small park, collapsing onto a bench as the weight of the evening's revelations crashed down upon him. His whole life, everything he thought he knew about himself and his family, had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. As Jake sat there, trying to make sense of it all, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Michael, William's head of security, walking towards him. "Your grandmother asked me to make sure you were safe," Michael said, sitting down next to Jake. "She's worried about you." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Did you know about Mr. Hartley being my father?" Michael shook his head. "No, I didn't. But I've worked for Mr. Hartley for many years, and I've seen him carry the weight of a secret for a long time. Now I understand why." They sat in silence for a moment, the distant sound of traffic providing a backdrop to Jake's tumultuous thoughts. "You know," Michael said finally, "life isn't always black and white, Jake. Sometimes good people make mistakes, and those mistakes have consequences that ripple out for years." Jake looked at him, his young face etched with pain and confusion. "But why did they lie to me? Why didn't anyone tell me the truth?" Michael sighed. "Adults often think they're protecting children by keeping secrets. But in my experience, the truth has a way of coming out one way or another." As they sat there, Jake's mind drifted to his mother. Did she know that William was back in their lives? How would she react when she found out? "What happens now?" Jake asked, his voice small and uncertain. Michael stood, offering his hand to Jake. "Now we go back and face this together. Your family loves you, Jake. That hasn't changed. And Mr. Hartley, well, he's got a lot of explaining to do, but I think he wants to make things right." Jake hesitated for a moment before taking Michael's hand. As they walked back towards the restaurant, he felt like he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one filled with uncertainties, but also with the possibility of answers, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to know the father he never knew he had. The Chicago skyline loomed before them, a glittering testament to the city's resilience and ability to rebuild. Jake couldn't help but wonder if his fractured family could do the same. As they approached the restaurant, Jake saw William and Margaret waiting anxiously outside. The sight of them, his grandmother who had always been there for him, and the father he never knew he had, filled him with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Whatever came next, Jake knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the explosive revelation at the restaurant were a whirlwind of emotions for Jake. He felt like he was living in a fog, going through the motions of his daily life, while his mind struggled to process the seismic shift in his world. At home, the atmosphere was tense. Sophia, Jake's mother, had returned from her late shift at the diner to find her son in tears and her own mother, Margaret, looking years older with worry. The ensuing conversation had been filled with tears, raised voices, and long, heavy silences. "How could you keep this from me?" Jake had demanded. His young face contorted with hurt and betrayal. Sophia's eyes were red-rimmed, her voice hoarse from explaining and apologizing. "I thought I was protecting you, sweetheart. I never meant to hurt you." Now, a week later, Jake sat at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around in his bowl. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sophia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jake, honey, Mr. Hartley, your father. He's asked to meet with us today. Are you up for that?" Jake's spoon clattered against the bowl. He looked up at his mother, searching her face for guidance. "Do you think I should?" Sophia sighed, pulling up a chair next to him. "That's entirely up to you, Jake. I know this is all overwhelming, but William, he wants to make things right. He wants to be part of your life." Jake's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Part of him was curious, eager even, to know more about the father he'd never had. But another part, the part that felt betrayed and lied to, wanted to shut William out completely. "Will you be there?" he asked, his voice small. Sophia nodded, squeezing his hand. "Every step of the way, if you want me to be." After a moment's hesitation, Jake nodded. "Okay, I'll meet him." Later that afternoon, Jake found himself seated in the living room of a luxurious penthouse apartment, the Chicago skyline sprawling out beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. William Hartley sat across from him, looking decidedly less imposing in casual clothes than he had in his business suit at the airport. Sophia sat next to Jake, a silent pillar of support. The tension in the room was palpable. William cleared his throat. "Jake, I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this past week must have been incredibly difficult for you." Jake remained silent, his eyes fixed on the plush carpet beneath his feet. "I owe you an explanation," William continued, his voice heavy with regret, "and an apology. What happened all those years ago? It's no excuse, but I want you to understand." As William began to speak, Jake found himself drawn into a story of young love, impossible choices, and the weight of family expectations. William had been fresh out of business school, working for his father's real estate company when he met Sophia. She was waitressing to put herself through nursing school, and their connection had been instant and electric. "But my father," William explained, his voice tight with old pain, "he had other plans for me. He'd arranged a marriage with Rebecca, the daughter of his biggest business rival. It was meant to be a merger of families, of empires." Jake's head snapped up. "So you just abandoned my mom because your dad told you to?" William winced at the accusation in Jake's voice. "It wasn't that simple. I was young, scared, and under immense pressure. I made a choice that I've regretted every day since." Sophia spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Jake, I don't want you to think I was some helpless victim in all this. I made my choices too. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I chose not to tell William. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone." Jake's mind reeled. He'd always imagined his father as some nameless, faceless man who'd run out on them. But this was so much more complicated. "What about my half-sister?" Jake asked, remembering Rebecca's words at the restaurant. "Do I have other siblings I don't know about?" William nodded, a sad smile playing at his lips. "You have a half-sister, Emma. She's 16, and a half-brother, Thomas, who's 14. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions at this news. Siblings he'd never known existed, a whole other family he was suddenly connected to. "Do they know about me?" he asked. William shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first, to see if you'd be open to meeting them someday." The room fell silent as Jake processed this information. It was all so much to take in. "I understand if you need time," William said gently. "I know I have no right to expect anything from you. But I want you to know, Jake, that I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life if you'll let me." Jake looked at his mother, searching her face for guidance. Sophia squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's your decision, sweetheart. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." Taking a deep breath, Jake turned back to William. I think I need some time to process all of this." William nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As they prepared to leave, William hesitated, then reached for something on a nearby table. "Jake, I have something for you. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but—" He held out a small wrapped package. Jake took it hesitantly, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "It's a phone," William explained. "My number's programmed in it. If you ever want to talk or have questions or anything, I'm just a call away." Jake stared at the package, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Finally, he nodded, slipping it into his pocket. As they rode the elevator down to the lobby, Jake's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. He had a father now, a real flesh-and-blood father who wanted to be part of his life. He had siblings he'd never met. He had a whole other family waiting in the wings. But he also had his mom and his grandma, the two pillars of his life who had always been there for him. How would this new reality fit into the life he'd always known? As they stepped out into the bustling Chicago street, Jake felt like he was seeing the city with new eyes. The towering skyscrapers, the endless possibilities. It all seemed to mirror the new landscape of his life, full of unknowns and potential. Sophia wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You okay, kiddo?" Jake leaned into her embrace, drawing comfort from her familiar presence. "I don't know, Mom, it's all so big." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart, we'll figure it out together, okay? One day at a time." As they walked home, Jake's hand drifted to his pocket, feeling the weight of the phone William had given him. It represented a choice, a bridge to a new part of his life if he chose to cross it. For now, though, he was content to walk with his mom, to go home to the apartment he'd always known, to the life that was familiar and safe. The future, with all its complications and possibilities, could wait for another day. That night, as Jake lay in bed, his mind replayed the events of the past week. From the overheard conversation at the airport, to the revelation at the restaurant, to today's meeting with William, it felt like a lifetime had passed in just a few days. He thought about William, the father he'd never known he had. The man was still largely a mystery to him, a complex figure of power and regret. Jake couldn't help but wonder what his life might have been like if William had been part of it from the beginning. Then there were his half-siblings, Emma and Thomas. What were they like? Did they know about him? Would they want to meet him? The thought of having a brother and sister was both exciting and terrifying. As Jake drifted off to sleep, his dreams were a jumble of faces. His mom, his grandma, William, and two shadowy figures that might have been Emma and Thomas. In his dream, they were all seated around a big table, laughing and talking like a real family. When Jake woke the next morning, the dream lingered, leaving him with a mix of longing and uncertainty. He reached for the phone William had given him, turning it over in his hands. He hadn't turned it on yet, hadn't made that step to connect with his newfound father. As he got ready for school, Jake realized that while his world had been turned upside down, life went on. He still had homework to do, friends to see, a normal 11-year-old life to live. But now there was this whole other world waiting for him, if he chose to explore it. Walking to school, Jake felt different. He stood a little taller, looked at the world around him with new eyes. He was still Jake Thompson, but now he was also Jake Hartley, son of a millionaire, brother to siblings he'd never met, heir to a legacy he was just beginning to understand. Whatever came next, Jake knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. And as scary as that was, there was also a part of him that was excited to see what the future held. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself settling into a new routine. School, homework, and helping out at his grandmother's store remained constants, but now there was a new element in his life: regular text messages from William. At first the messages were tentative, almost awkward, a simple "how was your day" or "hope you're doing well." Jake's responses were equally brief, unsure of how to navigate this new relationship. But gradually, the exchanges became more frequent, more personal. William would share anecdotes from his day, ask about Jake's interests, or offer words of encouragement when Jake mentioned a tough test coming up. One Saturday morning, as Jake was helping Margaret stock shelves at the store, his phone buzzed with a new message from William. "There's a Cubs game this afternoon. Would you like to go? Your mom is welcome too, of course." Jake's heart raced. As he read the message, he'd always loved baseball, but tickets to Cubs games were expensive, a luxury his family couldn't often afford. "Can I, Grandma?" Jake asked, showing Margaret the message. Margaret's face was a mix of emotions, concern, resignation, and a hint of something Jake couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? "It's up to you and your mother, Jake," she said finally. "But remember, William may be your father, but he's still essentially a stranger. Be careful." Jake nodded, understanding his grandmother's caution. He quickly texted his mum, who was working a shift at the diner. Her response came a few minutes later. "If you want to go, it's okay with me. I have to. Work, but stay close to William and be safe. Love you." With butterflies in his stomach, Jake replied to William, "Yes, I'd like to go, thank you." That afternoon, Jake found himself walking into Wrigley Field beside William Hartley. The energy of the crowd, the smell of hot dogs and popcorn, the bright green of the carefully manicured field, it was all almost overwhelming. As they settled into their seats, premium spots right behind home plate, William handed Jake a brand new Cubs cap. "I wasn't sure if you had one," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Jake ran his fingers over the embroidered logo. "Thanks," he said softly. "This is really cool." As the game progressed, Jake found himself relaxing. William, it turned out, was a wealth of baseball knowledge. He explained the finer points of the game, shared stories of historic Cubs moments, and cheered enthusiastically alongside Jake when their team scored. During the seventh-inning stretch, as they stood to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," Jake felt a surge of something. Not quite belonging, not yet, but a sense of possibility. For a moment he could imagine a world where outings like this with his father were normal, expected even. But reality came crashing back as they exited the stadium after the game. A small group of reporters were waiting, cameras flashing as they spotted William. "Mr. Hartley, is this your son, the boy from the airport incident? William, care to comment on the rumors about your family?" William's arm came around Jake's shoulders, guiding him quickly through the crowd. "No comment," he said firmly, his voice taking on a tone Jake hadn't heard before, authoritative, almost intimidating. Once they were safely in William's car, Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "I'm sorry about that," William said, his voice tight. "I should have anticipated they might be there." Jake nodded, still a bit shaken. "Is it always like that for you?" William sighed. "Sometimes, being in the public eye, it comes with challenges. But don't worry, I'll make sure they respect your privacy." As they drove back to Jake's neighborhood, a comfortable silence fell between them. Jake found himself thinking about the stark contrast between William's world and his own. The expensive seats at the game, the luxury car they were riding in, the reporters clamoring for William's attention, it was all so far removed from Jake's usual life. "I had a good time today," Jake said as they pulled up in front of his apartment building. "Thanks for inviting me." William's face lit up with a genuine smile. "I'm glad, Jake. I had a wonderful time too. Maybe we could do this again sometime." Jake nodded, returning the smile. "Yeah, I'd like that." As he watched William's car drive away, Jake felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Excitement about the fun day he'd had, confusion about where he fit in William's world, and a nagging worry about what all of this meant for his relationship with his mom and grandma. Upstairs, he found Sophia waiting for him, her face a mix of anxiety and curiosity. "How was it, honey?" she asked as soon as he walked in. Jake launched into an excited recap of the game, showing off his new cap and recounting William's baseball stories. Sophia listened with a smile, but Jake couldn't help noticing a hint of sadness in her eyes. Later that night, as Jake was getting ready for bed, he overheard a hushed conversation between his mom and grandma in the kitchen. "Can't just waltz back into our lives like this," Margaret was saying, her voice tight with emotion. "Mom, I know you're worried," Sophia replied, "but Jake deserves to know his father. And William seems genuinely committed to being part of his life. And what happens when he loses interest?" Margaret shot back. "When the novelty wears off and he goes back to his real family?" Jake's heart clenched at his grandmother's words. He hadn't considered that possibility, that William's interest in him might be temporary. "We can't think like that," Sophia said firmly. "For Jake's sake, we have to give this a chance." As Jake crawled into bed, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The excitement of the day was now tinged with uncertainty. Where did he truly belong? In the modest but loving home he'd always known, or in William's world of wealth and privilege? The next few weeks brought more outings with William, a visit to the Field Museum, a boat tour on Lake Michigan, even a day at William's office, where Jake got to see the inner workings of a major real estate company. But with each outing, Jake felt the divide between his two worlds growing. At school, he found himself hesitating to talk about his experiences with William, aware that his friends couldn't relate to things like box seats at Cubs games or private boats on the lake. At home, he sensed a growing tension. Though Sophia, remained supportive. Jake could see the strain in her eyes whenever William was mentioned. Margaret, for her part, made little effort to hide her disapproval, her comments about William becoming increasingly bitter. One evening, as Jake was doing homework at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed with a message from William. "Big news. I've enrolled you in St. Ignatius College Prep for next year. It's one of the best schools in Chicago. We'll talk more about it this weekend." Jake stared at the message, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. St. Ignatius was indeed a prestigious school, but it was also far from his neighborhood, far from his friends. And William had made this decision without even talking to him or his mom first. As if on cue, Sophia walked into the kitchen. Seeing Jake's troubled expression, she asked, "What's wrong, honey?" Jake wordlessly handed her the phone. As Sophia read the message, her face hardened. "He had no right," she muttered, more to herself than to Jake. Then, louder, "Don't worry, Jake. I'll talk to William. This is not his decision to make alone." That night, Jake lay awake long after he should have been asleep, listening to his mother's muffled voice as she argued with William on the phone. The raised voices, the long silences, the sound of barely suppressed tears. It all served to deepen Jake's sense of being torn between two worlds. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake found himself longing for the simplicity of his life before that fateful day at the airport. But deep down, he knew there was no going back. The truth was out, and now he had to figure out how to navigate this new, complicated reality. The next morning, Jake woke to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. "Mom," Jake said tentatively, sliding into the chair across from her. Sophia looked up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart. We need to talk about some things." As Jake sat there listening to his mother explain the conversation she'd had with William, he felt a surge of emotions. Anger at William for making decisions without consulting them, fear of the changes looming on the horizon, and a deep aching sadness for the simple life he'd lost. But beneath it all there was also a flicker of something else, a determination to find his place in this new, complex world, to forge a path that honored both parts of his heritage, the hard-working, close-knit family he'd always known, and the new opportunities his connection to William presented. As Sophia finished speaking, Jake took a deep breath. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Sophia reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Now, we figure this out together, as a family, all of us." Jake nodded, squeezing his mother's hand. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to face the challenges ahead. The summer sun beat down on the Chicago sidewalk as Jake made his way to William's office. It had been 3 months since that day at the airport, 3 months of navigating a new and complex family dynamic. Today was the day they would finally address the elephant in the room, Jake's future schooling and his place in William's life. As the elevator climbed to the top floor of the imposing skyscraper, Jake's stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. When he stepped into William's office, he was surprised to see not just his father, but also his mother, grandmother, and Michael Carter, William's head of security. "Jake," William said, rising from behind his desk, "thank you for coming. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation about our future." Jake nodded, taking a seat between his mother and grandmother. The tension in the room was palpable. William cleared his throat. "First, I want to apologize for my presumptuous behavior regarding St. Ignatius. I realize now that I overstepped. Jake, your education and your future are decisions that should involve all of us, especially you." Sophia spoke up, her voice firm but not unkind. "William, we appreciate that, but this isn't just about school. It's about Jake's entire life. You can't just sweep in after 11 years and expect to make all the decisions." William nodded, a look of genuine remorse on his face. "You're right, Sophia. I've been overzealous in my attempts to make up for lost time. Jake, I hope you can forgive me." Jake felt a lump in his throat. I just want to know where I fit in all of this. In your life, in your family." The room fell silent for a moment. It was Margaret who broke the silence, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Jake, honey, you've always known where you fit in our family. Nothing will ever change that." William leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jake's. "And I want you to know that you have a place in my family, too. Emma and Thomas, they know about you now. They want to meet you when you're ready." Jake's eyes widened. "They do?" William nodded. "They're curious about their brother. But I've made it clear that this all happens on your terms, Jake, no pressure." As the conversation continued, Jake found himself opening up about his fears and hopes. He talked about feeling torn between two worlds, about his worry that he'd have to choose between his old life and the new opportunities William offered. To Jake's surprise, it was Michael who offered a perspective that seemed to resonate with everyone. "You know," Michael said, speaking up for the first time, "family isn't about choosing sides, it's about building bridges. Jake, you have a unique opportunity here to bring two worlds together, not to be torn apart by them." As Jake looked around the room, he saw nods of agreement. Even Margaret, who had been the most resistant to William's presence in their lives, seemed to be considering Michael's words. William leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. What if we looked at this as an opportunity to create something new? Not my family or Jake's existing family, but a blended family that includes all of us?" Sophia raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you proposing, William?" "A compromise," William said. "Jake continues at his current school, but we set up a college fund for him. I'd like to be involved in his life, but not at the expense of his relationship with you and Margaret. We could have regular family dinners, including Emma and Thomas, when Jake is ready. And perhaps down the line we could look at educational opportunities together, as a family." Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This wasn't about choosing between his two worlds. It was about bringing them together. "I'd like that," Jake said softly. "I want to get to know you and Emma and Thomas, but I don't want to lose what I have with Mom and Grandma either." Sophia squeezed Jake's hand. "We're not going anywhere, sweetheart. We're just expanding our family circle." As they hammered out the details of their new arrangement, Jake felt a sense of hope blossoming in his chest. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But for the first time since that day at the airport, he felt like he could see a clear path forward. The next few months brought a whirlwind of changes. True to his word, William became a regular presence in Jake's life, but in a way that respected the boundaries Sophia and Margaret had set. Family dinners became a weekly occurrence, sometimes at William's penthouse, other times at the modest Thompson apartment. Jake watched with amazement as his two worlds slowly began to mesh. William learned to appreciate Margaret's home-cooked meals, while Sophia and Margaret gradually warmed to William's genuine efforts to be part of their lives. The most nerve-wracking moment came when Jake finally met Emma and Thomas. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a picnic in Millennium Park. Jake had been a bundle of nerves, but as soon as Emma enveloped him in a warm hug and Thomas challenged him to a game of frisbee, he felt the tension melt away. "You know," Emma said as they sat on the grass, watching William and Thomas toss a football, "we always knew Dad had a secret. We just never imagined it would be a cool little brother?" Jake grinned, feeling a warmth spread through his chest at being called a brother. "I never imagined I'd have a sister who could recite all the US presidents backwards." As summer turned to fall, Jake found himself settling into a new normal. He still helped out at his grandmother's store, but now William would sometimes stop by chatting with Margaret about the neighborhood and sampling her famous homemade cookies. At school, Jake's friends were initially wide-eyed at the revelation that Jake's dad was the William Hartley, but they soon got used to seeing William's car at school events alongside Sophia's beat-up sedan. One crisp October evening, as Jake sat on the front steps of his apartment building, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few short months. The sound of laughter drifted from inside, where William, Sophia, Margaret, Emma, and Thomas were setting up for a family game night. Michael, who had become something of a mentor to Jake, sat down beside him. "Penny for your thoughts, kid?" Jake smiled. I was just thinking about that day at the airport, how different everything is now. Michael nodded. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs at us, but it's not about the curveball, it's about how you choose to swing at it. I think, Jake said slowly, I'm glad I chose to swing. As they headed back inside, Jake paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. William and Sophia were playfully arguing over Monopoly rules, while Margaret dealt out the cards and Emma and Thomas set up the board. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still hurts that were healing, but it was family. His family. Jake thought back to that moment in the airport when he'd made the split-second decision to warn a stranger about a potential threat. He could never have imagined where that choice would lead him, but as he joined his family at the table, Jake knew that he wouldn't change a thing. The apartment filled with laughter and friendly competition as the game began. Jake looked around at the faces of his expanded family, the mother who had raised him, the grandmother who had always been there, the father he was just getting to know, and the siblings he never knew he wanted. In that moment, he felt a sense of belonging that transcended the boundaries of wealth or background. As the evening wore on, Jake excused himself to get a glass of water. In the kitchen, he found himself face to face with a framed photo on the refrigerator. It was a picture from the Cubs game, his first outing with William. Next to it was a worn photo of Jake as a toddler, held in Sophia's arms, Margaret beaming beside them. The juxtaposition of these two images, his past and his present, struck Jake profoundly. He realized that his life hadn't been upended by the revelation of his father's identity. Rather, it had been enriched, expanded. He hadn't lost anything. He had gained a whole new dimension to his world. William's voice called from the living room, "Jake, it's your turn. Hurry up before your sister buys all the properties." "Coming," Jake called back, a grin spreading across his face. As he rejoined the game, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't been easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But Jake knew now that he had the strength to face whatever came his way, because he wasn't just Jake Thompson anymore, or Jake Hartley. He was Jake, son, grandson, brother, and the bridge between two worlds that had collided in the most unexpected of ways. As the night drew to a close and goodbyes were said, Jake found himself enveloped in a group hug, surrounded by the warmth and love of his unconventional but perfect family. And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right.